Good morning. I'm Vicki Wynn in for Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. Right now on Morning News Now, in the hands of the jury, deliberations begin today in the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse, the teenager charged with killing 2 men and injuring another during a protest in Wisconsin last year. This morning, jurors left to decide between 2 very different portrayals of Rittenhouse. The prosecution saying he was looking for trouble, and the defense claiming he was a victim who was ambushed.
You cannot claim self-defense against a danger you create.
Kyle was a 17-year-old kid out there trying to help this community.
We're in Kenosha this morning with the newest developments, including one of the charges already tossed as we await a verdict. Critical test. President Biden celebrating the signing of that more than $1 trillion infrastructure bill. But the celebration may be short-lived as his approval rating drops to new lows over inflation concerns. Plus, the president looking to ease tensions with China, his meeting with President Xi Jinping, and what it could mean for the future of relations between the two countries. Courtroom questioning. Hundreds of potential jurors set to report to court today for jury selection in the high-profile sex trafficking trial of British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell. More on the charges she faces linked to the crimes of disgraced late billionaire Jeffrey Epstein. And disconnected, a warning to people with older cell phones why the major providers are shutting down 3G service and what it could mean for the millions of people who still use it.
Yeah, that's going to be a big headache for folks. They've got to upgrade.
I know, it really is going to be. I'm always getting those like software update alerts on my iPhones and always ignoring them. So that's a good warning for me, too, just to stay up to date with all that kind of stuff because you get too far behind. And we're happy to have you with us today.
Always good to be with you. All right, a lot to get to.
There is. We begin with the Kyle Rittenhouse homicide trial, now in the hands of the jury, which will begin deliberations this morning.
Rittenhouse faces 5 charges, including intentional homicide, after killing 2 men and injuring a third last time.
You cannot claim self-defense against a danger you create. That's critical right here. If you're the one who is threatening others, you lose the right to claim self-defense.
Kyle Rittenhouse shot Mr. Rosenbaum because he was attacking Kyle. Every person who was shot was attacking Kyle. One with a skateboard, one with his hands, one with his feet, one with a gun.
And there they were yesterday, the prosecution and defense making their closing arguments. Joining us now, NBC News legal analyst and former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuaid, and on the ground in Kenosha, Wisconsin, NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber. Good morning to you both. And Ellison, we're going to start with you. The prosecution and the defense, they had their final opportunity to make their case before the jury. Tell us, what were some of the highlights from their closing arguments?
So the prosecution began their closing arguments by asking the jury to ask themselves, why was Kyle Rittenhouse really in Kenosha? They say he came from out of town, that he did not know this business that he was said to be protecting, Car Source, at all prior to the evening, and that the owners themselves didn't care enough to stay, and that they had cleared everything out for the most part and had left by that point. They focused a lot on drone video from the very first shooting involving Joseph Rosenbaum. It's video that came into the trial fairly late compared to other videos, but the prosecution has really zeroed in on that, playing it again and again, slowing it down. They say it shows Kyle Rittenhouse walking up to that Car Source area where he's about to interact in moments with Joseph Rosenbaum, putting down a fire extinguisher he had in his hand and then pointing his rifle at a couple that was nearby, and then also Rosenbaum. Then they say what happened next was that Rosenbaum gave chase. They're trying to convince the jury that that moment right there triggered everything else, and that in that moment, Kyle Rittenhouse was provoking Rosenbaum, and therefore he lost the right to self-defense. Now, the defense argued that the video didn't show that, or at times it was not clear, or other video. They focused a lot on attacking the credibility of some of the witnesses and the 3 individuals who were shot here, saying that Rosenbaum was a crazy guy, a bad guy, saying he was not chasing Kyle Rittenhouse down that night to give him a key to the city, and that Kyle Rittenhouse had no choice but to use lethal force to protect himself. Vicki, Savannah.
And Barbara, let's bring you in here. So Judge Schrader has already gotten a lot of attention during this trial, lashing out at the prosecution at times over judicial procedure. The judge's instructions to the jury, which were delivered before closing arguments yesterday, were also contentious. Let's listen to that.
I just worry that the more we deviate from these standard instructions, the more we get into these issues. I think we should stick with what you drafted, which has been sent to the parties. We've all agreed on them, and I am leery of any additional language that hasn't been cleared by the parties and could cause further confusion.
So can you walk us through the instructions that the judge gave and why this step is so important to a trial?
Yes, well, as you heard, in this case, the law is actually a little bit complicated under Wisconsin law because it sort of gives self-defense. It takes it away if you provoke, but then it kind of gives it back if you thought you had no other alternative. In that way, it's a little bit unusual. It also does not account for what's known as imperfect self-defense, which says even if what you did was unreasonable, if you genuinely believed it was necessary, that is a defense to the highest crimes, but not to these lesser included crimes. And that's not available. They only have what's called perfect self-defense in Wisconsin. So it is complicated. There are a number of charges, and each of those has a number of lesser included offenses. The thing I fault the judge for here is not working this out before he began reading it to the jury. Usually there are issues. The parties will disagree about what exactly should be read to the jury because it really is important that they get the law correct as they apply it. But that's why you want to get it all done in one reading and not have a disjointed reading because you get interrupted along the way. I think the judge was right that there was a problem, but I think they should have worked it out before they started reading it.
Barbara, thank you. Ellison, you've been following this very closely. The judge threw out one of the charges, a misdemeanor weapons charge, but said he will allow the jury to consider other lesser charges. So how does this change the equation for the prosecution and the defense, and now for the jury who has to decide this verdict?
Well, so that misdemeanor charge, which was the illegal possession of a weapon by a minor, that was something that had been discussed, and the defense had wanted to have that removed prior to heading into the trial. But it was surprising that the judge made this decision so last minute. Basically, what they argued was that there was a technicality in the Wisconsin statute and that that law specifically applies to short-barreled shotguns or rifles, and that Kyle Rittenhouse had a long barrel. So that's ultimately what came into play there. That, though, was a charge that legal experts have consistently said was going to be kind of the easiest, most simply proven charge for the prosecution to get a conviction on here. So they lost that. That being said, the 5 charges, the 5 counts that still remain, those are all felony charges, 3 of them related to homicides. The first 3, the judge decided that he would not allow any lesser charges to be considered, even though the prosecution did ask. But on count 4 and 5, they are having lesser charges that they can consider. So count 4, they can look, and that relates, the first one that relates to the shooting of Anthony Huber. If they cannot reach a consensus and agreement on first-degree intentional homicide, they can move to 2 other lesser charges related to that. Same deal in the shooting of Gage Grosskreutz, the sole person who survived. Guys.
And Barbara, quickly before we let you go, a process question here. So 18 jurors heard this case, but only 12 will deliberate and then potentially reach that verdict. How are those 12 jurors decided?
They'll just pull the names at random. They'll be selected. You know, ordinarily that's very common to have a few extra alternates in case people get sick along the way. But they'll be selected randomly from these 18, and 6 will be told to stand by in case deliberations take such time and somebody has to drop out.
All right, Barbara McQuaid and Ellison Barber, thank you so much for helping us through this morning.
And staying in Kenosha, residents and businesses are keeping a close eye on the Rittenhouse trial as they brace for the possibility of protests and violence. NBC News correspondent Shaquille Brewster shows us how the city is preparing for the outcome of the verdict.
City on edge. Kenosha bracing for a verdict in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. Governor Tony Evers mobilizing 500 National Guard members in preparation of the potential outcome. In a statement saying, quote, "I urge folks who are otherwise not from the area to please respect the community by reconsidering any plans to travel there and encourage those who might choose to assemble and exercise their First Amendment rights to do so safely and peacefully." Officials and businesses fearing a repeat of the violence that took place in August of last year after the police shooting of Jacob Blake, leaving 100 businesses damaged and 2 dead in the shooting that has Rittenhouse on trial. Stores and restaurants now boarded up in anticipation of potential crowds and unrest. Some have been this way since those riots. The people of Kenosha bracing for more violence as they grapple with the pain of what has already happened.
Hurt. hurt because of the whole scenario. It started with Jacob Lake, and now it's ending with Kyle Rittenhouse. I do not like him, but I think he should be found not guilty. I think the kid's a punk. I think he was here looking for trouble, and he found it.
Scott Anderson saying the city is still recovering and echoing the calls for peace.
But I don't want to see it again. I do not want to see it again. It broke my heart.
Yeah, he's not alone there. And that was Shaquille Brewster reporting for us from Kenosha.
President Biden's $1 trillion infrastructure bill has been finally signed into law, ending a hard-fought battle to push through one of the signature items on his agenda. In a signing ceremony yesterday, the president praised bipartisan efforts to get the legislation over the line and said it would transform the lives of Americans.
Here in Washington, we've heard countless speeches and promises and white papers from experts. But today, we're finally getting this done. So my message to the American people is this: America's moving again, and your life is going to change for the better.
Soon after the signing, President Biden attended a virtual meeting with China's President Xi Jinping in a longer-than-expected summit aimed at easing tensions between the world's most powerful nations. The leaders discussed topics including competition, climate change, and Taiwan. NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli joins us now, along with NBC News foreign correspondent Janice Mackey-Freyer, who's in Beijing. Good morning to both of you. Mike, I'll start things off with you. So the president will be relieved to finally push through one of his big ticket policies officially here. And yesterday's ceremony was an opportunity also to tout the bipartisan nature of this bill, as I mentioned. Did he succeed in doing that? And what's next on the agenda? What about the social safety net package?
Yeah, good morning, Savannah. I was out on the South Lawn for what was a lengthy program on a very brisk Washington afternoon, and it was interesting to hear the different speakers as part of the program. For instance, Vice President Harris and Speaker Pelosi really using their remarks to highlight the historic nature of this accomplishment. They were comparing what the president signed into law to, for instance, the Transcontinental Railroad under Abraham Lincoln or the Interstate Highway Project under President Eisenhower. But when we heard from the president himself, he spoke much more directly to the American people, acknowledging the pain many are feeling in their pocketbooks right now, stressing the fact that the American people, when we work together, can accomplish big things. And yes, now the focus turns to the next part of his agenda. The White House is saying that they are confident that the larger reconciliation package will be moving forward. And that was another part of what we heard from so many of the officials yesterday, saying this is only the beginning of what is a big step forward for the administration.
And, Mike, the other thing we mentioned here, soon after that signing, the president sat down for a virtual meeting with his Chinese counterpart. Were there any major breakthroughs there?
Well, what was so interesting is every conversation I had with the White House before this meeting, they were downplaying expectations of what we call deliverables, of any tangible sort of announcements that might come out in terms of what these two leaders might break through on substance. But what they did say and what they stressed was that because President Xi has really consolidated power so much in China, these direct leader-to-leader conversations are so important. Here was the president laying out what his hopes were at the top of that meeting.
It seems to me we need to establish some common sense guardrails to be clear and honest where we disagree and work together where interests intersect, especially on vital global issues like climate change. We have a responsibility to the world as well as to our people. It's why we believe, and you and I have talked about this, all countries have to play by the same rules of the road.
Now, what we did hear from White House officials afterwards was that the subject of Taiwan was probably one of the major points of conflict in this conversation. The White House, the president, in his conversation with President Xi, underscoring that the United States still subscribed to the one China policy, but urging China not to do anything that would disrupt the status quo, a real source of tension right now.
And Janice, let's bring you in here and keep on this conversation. So Chinese state media had some particularly interesting insight into the conversation on Taiwan. What is President Xi reported to have said about that, and what's the reaction been like over there to this meeting in general?
Well, most of the headlines have been emphasizing President Biden's comments on Taiwan, specifically that the U.S. does not support Taiwan independence. And it's getting hashtagged all over social media and really playing up this sense of strength in the Chinese position. Remember, Beijing went into this meeting expecting that President Xi would tell President Biden that Taiwan is a red line for China. They see this as a sovereignty issue. They say there will be reunification in the foreseeable future, no matter the cost. President Xi apparently blamed the tension with Taiwan these days over on the authorities in Taiwan, the government in Taiwan, saying that they were the ones who were fishing for U.S. support for an independence agenda. He went on to say, quote, "Such moves are extremely dangerous," he reportedly said. "Just like playing with fire, whoever plays with fire will get burned." This is according to state media outlet The Global Times. The thing is, for the U.S., nothing has changed in the U.S. position on Taiwan. And that line about independence, senior officials told us, have always been part of the U.S. policy. It's just not part of the U.S. statement today. The U.S. strongly opposing unilateral efforts to change the status quo, it says, or to undermine peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. So as Mike mentioned as well, Taiwan really dominating the conversation in this meeting today, and neither side appearing to move an inch.
Now, Janice, also, President Xi called Biden his old friend in that video we just played there a moment ago from the meeting. We saw them waving, smiling at each other. I mean, there appeared to be some effort on both sides of this to convey warmth towards each other. What would China like to see from its relationship with the U.S. going forward?
Well, they are not strangers. They've known each other for several years. There is this personal familiarity. When President Biden was here, they ate noodles together and they traveled around. And she did refer to him today as an old friend. But that was then. And the U.S.-China relationship is far more complicated now. And in many ways, it carries higher stakes. We also have to remember that Xi Jinping is coming into this meeting with unprecedented power here. Just last week, rewriting Communist Party history to be elevated to the status of the leader who will carry China into the next era of being a superpower. So that's bound to have some friction with the United States. Both sides went into this hoping to manage this stiff competition that has pushed relations to a very rocky place in history. And as President Biden said, to assure that the lines of communication are open enough that they don't find the two nations veering into conflict.
All right, Janice Mackey-Fair, Mike Memoli, thank you both so much.
Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon will be back in court on Thursday, where he's expected to enter a plea after being charged with 2 counts of contempt of Congress. Bannon surrendered to authorities yesterday after a federal grand jury indicted him for refusing to answer questions in the House committee's January 6th investigation. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams has more on what's next for Steve Bannon.
Steve Bannon turned himself into the FBI mob by cameras, his escorts clearing a path.
Excuse me.
One of those cameras was actually his, live streaming on his social media site.
Okay, we got the Hispanics coming on our side, African Americans coming on our side. We're taking down the Biden regime.
His more immediate challenge is a federal grand jury indictment, 2 counts charging contempt of Congress for refusing to produce documents or show up for questioning by the House committee investigating the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol. During a brief hearing in federal court, he was formally advised of the charges, released, and will enter a plea Thursday. Outside the courthouse, a defiant Bannon said he'll fight the charges, which he called politically motivated.
I'm telling you right now, this is going to be the misdemeanor from hell for Merrick Garland, Nancy Pelosi, and Joe Biden.
Bannon is the only former Trump White House aide subpoenaed who has totally refused to cooperate because the former president asserted executive privilege. 15 others have been subpoenaed.
If they're willing to talk to the committee about non-privileged matters, if they're willing to negotiate with the committee rather than just make a blanket assertion of privilege, they don't really have anything to fear. They won't be charged.
We now have a clearer idea of what Steve Bannon's defense will be. One key element will be this, that he will argue that he was simply following the advice of his lawyers when he declined to even show up to answer the House committee's questions. And in some past contempt cases, that defense has been a successful one. Savannah, Vicki?
Pete Williams, thank you so much.
Turning now to the state of the coronavirus in Europe, after nearly 2 million cases were reported across the region just last week. Countries there are now introducing restrictions on activities not seen since the early days of the pandemic. Austria has re-implemented a full-scale lockdown for unvaccinated citizens, while a partial lockdown is underway in the Netherlands, with businesses and restaurants closing early to try to get ahead of a spike in cases. The restrictive policies in Europe come as cases here in the U.S. remain elevated heading into the busy holiday travel season. Let's bring in Dr. Ahmaud Arbery for more on these new developments. Dr. Arbery is a senior scholar at Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. Doctor, good morning. So we so appreciate how straight with us you always are. So I just want to ask you, because so many of these headlines feel back and forth. It feels like we're seeing there's good news. We are in a better place with cases. Vaccination rates are going up. Boosters will soon be available to more people. But then we hear stuff like this, cases remaining elevated. And obviously we see what's going on in Europe right now, with some countries experiencing their worst surge in months. So is the U.S. in good shape heading into the winter months? Where do you think we're at right now?
You have to realize that we're still going to see an acceleration of cases because there's not enough people vaccinated. It's getting colder. People are going to go indoors. The goal has always been to keep those cases from translating into hospitalizations and deaths. And I do think because we've got maybe 58, 60% of the population fully vaccinated, we have monoclonal antibodies, we have antivirals that are on the cusp of being approved, and we've got some amount of the population that has immunity from prior infection. We hopefully won't see the cases that we're inevitably going to see translate into hospitals in trouble. That remains to be seen. There may be pockets of the country where there's high-risk people who haven't been vaccinated, where hospitals are going to struggle, just like we saw during the Delta surge. So I think there's a little bit of uncertainty of where this is going to go. But the thing is, we have the tool to stop this or to blunt this. It's just getting more people vaccinated. And we know that there's going to be transmission over holidays. The best way to make that holiday safe is to be vaccinated.
So I want to ask you a question specifically about that and use some examples from a new report out to kind of walk us through what exactly is happening here. So this is from NBC News. It's detailing a spike in cases among unvaccinated Americans in the New England area. I think we might have a graphic for you here. Here we go. So New England COVID cases rise as Delta hits the unvaccinated. Vermont and New Hampshire, as you can see, they're hit particularly hard. But Vermont, doctor, is one of the most vaccinated states in the U.S. So what does that mean? Are these breakthrough cases then? How is an area with, according to that most recent article from NBC News, 72% of residents fully vaccinated seeing a spike like that?
Well, 72 is not 100% or not 90%. And some of the European countries that have been able to stave off this surge have vaccination rates that are around 90%, for example, places like Portugal. So it's not enough with a more contagious variant. And what's happening is that this virus is moving through the unvaccinated population. And unvaccinated people tend to cluster together. They tend to live in the same counties. They tend to interact with each other. And that's where that virus is finding a hold. So it's not really impacting the vaccinated community to the degree that it's impacting the unvaccinated community. And it remains true that if you're unvaccinated, the Delta variant is going to find you. You're going to get infected. This virus is too contagious. So the best thing to do is to be vaccinated. And those states that are resting on those high vaccination numbers, they're still going to have their unvaccinated population get hit because it's not high enough.
And Doctor, quickly, let's talk about booster shots, something that people who are vaccinated are interested in. So now we're hearing that New York City and 3 other states, California, Colorado, New Mexico, are moving ahead with authorizing booster shots for all adults. And that's even though federal health agencies have not yet signed off on it. Is that the safest way of getting boosters out there for those who want them? And will more cities follow along with this? What do you think about that?
There's not much harm to getting a booster, but what you want to really focus on is where the benefit is for boosters. And I think that's the high-risk individuals, people above the age of 65, people with high-risk conditions, and those who got the J&J vaccine. But I understand that local public health authorities are frustrated because booster messaging has been really convoluted and mixed from the White House versus the CDC versus the FDA. So they want a simple solution. But I think those high-risk groups where boosters are absolutely necessary. For other healthy people, it's not going to harm you, but the benefit may be marginal. But we probably will see expansion of boosters, even though the benefit is really in a restricted group of people.
All right, Dr. Ahmaud Arbery, always great to have you. Thank you so much. Now, days of heavy rainfall and high winds led to major flooding in Washington state on Monday.
Bill Cairns joins us now with the latest updates. Hey, good morning, Bill.
Yeah, good morning. Scary situations. This is right along the border of British Columbia and northern Washington state. I mean, they had incredible amounts of rain. Even Seattle's had 7 inches of rain this month. And I know areas to the north there got worse. Interstate 5 had a mudslide that is closed. We've had numerous communities that have been cut off. The town of Sumas had the downtown flooded. On the British Columbia side, the town of Vernon of 7,000 people got flooded out, all evacuated. You can see the pictures there, just how severe this has been. many people had to be rescued by boats from their homes, and in some cases, people were on the second floors of their homes. There is one report of one man that was washed down a creek that is missing, that they are still looking for. So the flash flood watch has expired, but those areas in red are still rivers that are in flood stage. Again, the worst of it is north of Seattle. And as I said, I-5 is closed because of a large mudslide up around Bellingham, and there's no word how long that's going to take for the major interstate to be reopened. So this storm that brought that heavy rain is now moving through the northern plains. It is going to be a huge wind maker today and tomorrow through the northern plains. We have high wind warnings that cover portions of 4 states and just about all of Montana. And we could see in some of the high elevations gusts up to 100 miles per hour. So we're talking down trees, some minor structural damage, and power outages for a few locations. And here's some of what we're predicting. Here's the wind gusts that are expected for some of the big cities. You notice Billings up to 60, Glasgow 61, and it will be still pretty windy all the way into areas of the Dakotas. So for today's forecast, we're still chilly in the east. We still have record highs in some portions of the southern plains. So we got a little bit of everything except snow. We don't have too much snow on the map today, and that's just fine with me.
Yeah, not quite time yet. All right, Bill, thank you so much. See you next hour.
Okay.
And coming up, new developments this morning in the sex trafficking trial of British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell. Plus, dramatic moments in court lead to calls for a mistrial in the trial of 3 men accused of killing Ahmaud Arbery. The ruling by a judge and what it means for the case. You're watching Morning News Now. Jury selection begins today in the federal sex trafficking trial of Jeffrey Epstein's former girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell. She's accused of recruiting underage women for Epstein to allegedly sexually abuse from 1994 to 2004. Maxwell says she's innocent of the charges. NBC News correspondent for investigations Tom Winter joins us now from outside the courthouse in New York City. Tom, good morning. So before we get into the jury selection, I'll ask you about that in just a moment. Let's first remind our viewers what Ghislaine Maxwell is accused of. What was her involvement with Jeffrey Epstein, and what is she charged with?
Right. So she faces a host of charges here, including a sex trafficking conspiracy charge for, as you said, Savannah, activity from 1994 to 2004. Now, that's important because that predates the investigation in Florida, and it all has to have a nexus here to New York City. That's why federal prosecutors, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, were able to bring these charges. The grand jury handing up an indictment saying that she tried to entice minors to travel for the purposes of sex. She was involved in that sex trafficking conspiracy, allegedly, as I just mentioned, and then as well that she was involved in the abuse. They say that she was personally involved in the abuse. So there's a whole host of charges centered around that, and that's what she's facing here as this trial begins in earnest.
Now, jury selection, as we mentioned, is underway. So what do we know so far about the process?
Right. So over the past couple of weeks, jurors have been coming here to the courthouse, filling out questionnaires, essentially evaluating whether or not they can even be here for this trial, or if they have any particular conflicts with some of the names and some of the individuals that might be coming up here at this trial. So for folks, this trial expected to last for 6 weeks through the holidays. For people that have to travel for the holidays, for people that have business commitments, they can't be here. But as we stand here today, 213 people have qualified. They're going to be called before the judge, one person at a time, answer a question from the judge, this morning as to whether or not they can be impartial and whether or not they move on to the final pool of 50 to be picked.
And now, Tom, when can we expect that selection process to wrap up? And then when does that mean that oral arguments will begin? Walk us through the timeline for this trial.
It really depends on how quickly they can get through this questioning period, how quickly they can get to a pool of approximately 50 or so, that then both sides can use their strikes to challenge them and get down to that final jury pool. This may go up until opening statements on November 29th. They may pick from that pool on that morning, but we do anticipate opening statements on the 29th. The jury will be seated then, and as I mentioned, the trial going 6 weeks through the holidays.
All right. Tom Winter, thank you so much. Now, a judge in Georgia has denied a request for a mistrial in the trial of the 3 men accused of killing Ahmaud Arbery. The defense team said jurors were tainted by weeping in the courtroom. The defense also asked for civil rights activist Reverend Jesse Jackson to be removed. NBC News correspondent Ron Allen is following the trial from Brunswick, Georgia.
We object to his presence in the public gallery inside the courtroom.
Defense attorney Kevin Goff asking the judge to tell the Reverend Jesse Jackson, sitting with Ahmaud Arbery's parents, to leave the courtroom. Goff singling out Jackson after objecting last week to the Reverend Al Sharpton, who hosts a show on MSNBC, being in court. Both men invited there by Arbery's parents.
With all due respect, Your Honor, the seats in the public gallery of a courtroom are not like courtside seats at a Lakers game.
Mr. Goff, at this point, I'm not exactly sure what you're doing.
Last week, another defense attorney criticized Goff, but today they all joined his objections after Arbery's mother was heard sobbing in the gallery when prosecutors showed the jury a picture of her son.
Hey, who's that depicted in the picture?
Quez.
Okay. And you say Quez. Is that what you knew him as?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, if we could just take a moment, if we take a 5-minute recess.
It's becoming less and less about evidence and more about emotion with these kinds of outbursts and those kinds of photographs.
During a break, we asked Jackson about the defense's criticism. They're saying that you and the other pastors are trying to influence the jury.
I'm saying with the family. I don't know the jurors. I don't know any of them.
Right.
That's right.
Right.
Come on, Jim. That's right. Come on, Red.
I don't know any of them. If my person stands to reaffirm the innocence, victimhood of a young man who was killed.
As tension grew, eventually the defense attorneys asked for a mistrial, arguing that the atmosphere outside the courthouse, where a small group of Arbery supporters gather each day, and inside because of who's been in the public gallery, make it impossible for the defendants to get a fair trial.
I have said over and over and over in this trial that I am attempting to ensure that in this courtroom that the defendants receive a fair trial, and I will continue to do that.
The trial continued with several Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents testifying about how the fatal encounter unfolded, showing the jury the 12-gauge shotgun Travis McMichael used to shoot and kill Arbery, he says in self-defense, and Arbery's T-shirt bloodstained and with bullet holes. At one point, Arbery's father left the courtroom visibly upset. The prosecution's case appears to be winding down, and they've said their next witness will be the medical examiner, who will describe the wounds Arbery sustained and how he died. Expect another day of very graphic and emotional testimony.
All right, Ron Allen,
Vicky,
thank you
Savannah.
so much. Thanks, Ron. Now let's take a look at what's making news around the world this morning. Ali Arouzi joins us today from Tehran. Hey there, Ali.
Good morning, Savannah. Well, the U.S. has accused Russia of dangerous and irresponsible behavior after it conducted an anti-satellite weapons test that threatened the lives of 7 astronauts on board the International Space Station. Russia fired a missile at one of its own, generating a field of debris. NASA officials have traveled to Moscow and will seek to discuss the matter with Russian counterparts. However, the Russian Defense Ministry has accused the U.S. of hypocrisy. In the United Kingdom, 4 men arrested under terrorism laws after a bomb exploded outside Liverpool Women's Hospital on Sunday have been released without charge after police named Ahmaud Arbery as the man who died after a homemade bomb blew up in the back of a taxi. The suspect is understood to have been an asylum seeker who converted to Christianity. And finally, if you're after some high-quality apples, they don't get much more expensive than this. At an auction in Japan, a box containing 28 Sun Fuji apples sold for almost $9,000. That's just over $320 per apple. Around 64,000 boxes of the apples will be shipped around the world this season. And those are your headlines.
Wow. Oh, my goodness. All right, Ali, thank you so much. And coming up, getting candid about kids and mental health. Up next here on Morning News Now, we'll talk to a professional about the signs of a child in distress and what you can do to help at home and in the classroom after the break. Welcome back. Mel Gibson is returning to the Lethal Weapon franchise. The 65-year-old is set to step behind the camera to direct the 5th installment of the series. Speaking at an event reported by London newspaper The Sun, Gibson said he would take over directing duties from director Richard Donner, who died back in July. Gibson said Donner had begun to work on a screenplay for the film before he passed away. The action comedy series starred Gibson and Danny Glover as Los Angeles police detectives Martin Riggs and Roger Murtaugh. It's not confirmed that Gibson will also star in the movie or whether Glover will return, but filming is scheduled to begin next year. All right, time now to check in on some of the latest mental health headlines as part of our series here on Morning News Now. There's a new push to bring more mental health resources to the classroom and new ways we should be treating ourselves and each other as a result of the pandemic. Dr. George James joins us now. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist at the Council for Relationships. Dr. James, good morning. Thanks for joining us for this important conversation. So a group of doctors last month called Child and Adolescent Mental Health a national emergency. So now with federal COVID aid, schools are hoping to change that, actually. In Kansas City, schools now have a mental health clinic, and one New Jersey district is setting up emotional learning teams. Tell us, what are the warning signs that a child is battling mental health issues, and how do you want to see schools addressing this? What do you think about programs like these?
First of all, good morning, Savannah. And yes, we've seen that the increase in mental health needs and crises and struggles for so many people, including our young adult and our children. And so one of the things that we want to really pay attention to is any real change in behavior. Is there a change in their mood, especially that will last for a long time? So that could be outbursts, that could be sadness, that could be talking about death or suicide, that could be just violent behavior that maybe they just weren't showing before. So we really want to pay attention to these things. And if it persists for a while, that might be something to show you that your child might be going through. And then that's why I think having services within our schools could be helpful, or additional services, because sometimes as parents, we might not see it, but in school, they might show some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, so for kids, I mean, it might have been remote learning, but then also for adults, fractured careers, maybe tough relationship times throughout the pandemic really took a toll on people. So in Massachusetts, actually, state lawmakers are looking at a bill that would mandate coverage for annual mental health checkups, similar to, an annual physical. How would this expansion of access help people battling issues like anxiety or depression?
In a situation like this, it's preaching to the choir. As a licensed therapist who I've worked with individuals, couples, and families for many years, this is something that, that we've talked about, where that to be able to see mental health as just as important as our physical health, for people to be able to pay attention, to have checkups. Thankfully, more medical doctors are doing those checkups when they see their patients. They're asking them about depression and anxiety. And I think something like this could be helpful. I think in addition to this, we would really need to find a way how to add to the full system, because as we've seen even throughout COVID, is that a lot of the therapists are overwhelmed. They're receiving more and more requests. So I think there would also need to be a system of supporting therapists and clinicians so that they can provide these services as the demand could increase.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Dr. James. And quickly, we're now in the season of giving. It's the holiday time, and there's more research that actually shows giving and helping others can benefit your own mental health. Why is that?
A lot of the work that I do with people is really trying to help them get perspective on themselves and their situation. When we give to other people, it really helps us with perspective. It allows us to get out of our own heads and our own situation and think about somebody else. That can be helpful. Also, when we help other people, we realize that sometimes our situations might not be as dire or as awful as we might think. We might realize that other people are struggling and we can give and help other people. Lastly, helping other people just feels good, and it can allow us to be in a better place and can shift our mood when we might not be in the best place.
Dr. George James, what a great one to end on. Thank you so much. We always love having you, and thanks for this important conversation. See you soon.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Now, you've probably heard of the organization Make-A-Wish, where children with a terminal illness are given the opportunity to maybe take an epic family vacation or meet their favorite celebrity. Any wish they want granted. Well, one teenage boy didn't use his wish on himself. He decided what he really wanted was to help others. NBC News correspondent Kerry Sanders has his story.
13-year-old Abraham Olegregui knows he's different, but he thought it was because he was diagnosed with sometimes fatal aplastic anemia. But that's not what makes Abraham unique. Make-A-Wish said he could go to Disney, get a PlayStation, have a 21-speed bike.
Instead, you decided to what?
Feed the homeless.
Why?
Like a PlayStation would be nice, but to me, I just feel like it wouldn't do the justice, like all the pain and stuff I went through. So I just felt like it would have been right to just feed the homeless and just to give back.
Mom, what do you think here?
It overwhelms me. It just gives me so much joy.
A stranger donated life-saving bone marrow. Doctors say Abraham's now on his way to full recovery. Since he was 9, Abraham has joined his parents and 9 brothers and sisters feeding the homeless in Jackson, Mississippi. The Make-A-Wish gift will allow him to plate 700 meals for the next 8 months. It's not every day a 13-year-old teaches us a lesson.
Most of the homeless people, they had good childhoods. And you just don't know, one day you could be homeless. Before you put your nose in somebody else's business, put your heart in their place first.
Kerry Sanders, NBC News.
What an incredible story and an incredible young man. Coming up, Thanksgiving sticker shock. Turkey and all the fixings will likely be more expensive this year. What you can do to keep the cost down. Plus, the service shutdown that could make millions of people's phones useless. That's next on Morning News Now. With Thanksgiving next week, you might already be planning your grocery list. Well, you can expect the total at checkout to be the highest it's been in decades. So what's causing it and what can you do about it? NBC News business correspondent Ghislaine Maxwell explains.
Savannah, Vicki, good morning. You guys know the price of food has gone up. Inflation is very much a thing, and it's now going to be hitting your Thanksgiving grocery bill all across the board, and it starts with the turkey.
For millions gathering for the first in-person Thanksgiving in 2 years, be prepared to pay up. Thanks in part to a labor shortage in the supply chain, the retail price of turkeys is up 9 cents a pound compared to last year. The other reasons, the higher cost of corn to feed those turkeys and inflation.
What we're finding is that people in anticipation of perceived shortages is that they're rushing out to buy turkeys now. Our sales on turkeys were up 100% versus the same week year ago last week.
Grocery chain H-E-B says customers should be flexible.
What can shoppers expect to be in tight supply or delayed?
I think one of the areas that we're seeing right now is in pumpkin pie mix, is that not that we don't have it, but we may find that the shipping from a manufacturer to our stores is a day or two behind. But on the other hand, there are going to probably be 6 or 7 other brands that you can choose from.
Canned cranberry sauce is pricier because it's more expensive to produce steel cans and trucking costs are up. Packaged dinner rolls are more expensive because the price of some ingredients spiked. Bakeries like Republic of Pie ordered their flour months ago and were still forced to hike their prices by $1.75 a pie.
Naturally, we have to go up a little bit in price. We go up incrementally as much as we can without trying to shake and stir the restaurant and our customers.
Even pie boxes are in short supply.
I was told that they're not going to have for the rest of the month.
To stay on budget and get what you need, experts say buy frozen options and generic brands. And if you're celebrating as a group, truly share the costs. Don't leave the host solely on the hook.
And there's one more tip that may seem obvious, but it's good when you shop early, is you can comparison shop. You can look online, you can shop in your neighborhood to figure out exactly what works well for you to maximize your budget. But no matter what, it's going to be a very expensive Thanksgiving, so you may as well get started early. Guys?
Yeah, really, I'm hosting my first. I better do that. Thanks, Sterling. Now let's stay on your money with our CNBC Money Minute, the biggest financial headlines of the day and why they matter to you. Silvana Henao is with us. Hey, Silvana, good morning.
Hey, good morning. Yeah, so the iPhone 13 went on sale 9 weeks ago, but it's still harder to get one than the iPhone 12 was last year. JP Morgan says delivery times for the iPhone 13 are up to 10 days. And if you want a 13 Pro or Pro Max, you may have to wait almost a month. And it's the global semiconductor chip shortage that's impacting Apple's ability to deliver iPhones faster. JP Morgan says supply is not expected to catch up with demand until February. IBM's CEO says he's worried about inflation and warns of possible disruptions ahead. Arvind Krishna tells CNBC he's not sure it will have an impact on the company's business in 2022. However, he says there could be an economic slowdown if a new COVID variant emerges. He adds that vaccines and safety protocols are minimizing the impact of the virus. And say goodbye to disappearing tweets. Twitter is rolling out updates it promised in September to address a long-standing complaint that tweets sometimes disappear from view just as you're reading through them because your feed refreshes. A fix is now available on the web version of Twitter. It will make it so you can decide when to refresh your feed, and to do so, you can click the tweet counter bar at the top of the page. Back to you.
All right, I guess that makes sense. Silvana, thanks so much.
You got it.
Now, millions of Americans still own a 3G cell phone, and if you're one of them, your phone may stop working next year. NBC News technology correspondent Jake Ward shows us what we need to know as wireless networks are getting ready to shut down 3G.
The year 2022 has a futuristic ring to it, but it's the end of the line for millions of wireless devices. Third generation or 3G phones will soon stop working as wireless companies disconnect them. Why? Well, because the companies only have a certain number of frequencies they can use to connect us, and getting rid of old phones frees up valuable airwaves to connect more expensive ones.
The people that are going to be the most impacted by this are going to be the low income, the elderly, and then people that live in those areas that do not have access to 4 or 5G, because there's no easy path to an upgrade for them. They might not be able to afford an upgrade to a 4G or a 5G phone. And that's even saying if 4 or 5G is available in their area.
Boost Mobile, which sells some of the cheapest plans out there, says more than 1 million customers could lose out and is pressing former owner T-Mobile to extend service.
Are you okay? Do you need
some medical alert devices for seniors will also stop transmitting.
Emergency call center.
And that's it for certain roadside assistance systems in older cars from companies like Toyota and Audi. If you rely on an older home security system, medical device, or phone, check in with the manufacturer to make sure it's not going to be disconnected next year.
All right, our thanks to Jake Ward for that report. Now, some companies are offering free or discounted upgrades for older devices, but you should reach out because while your connection might end, billing probably won't. And coming up, unrest in Cuba. Police clash with protesters as concern grows about the living conditions there. We're on the ground with what's behind the conflict. This is Morning News Now.
Members of Cuba's communist government are taking to the streets of the island nation to prevent residents from taking part in planned protests against the government.
Yeah, authorities are trying to prevent a repeat of protests that took place over the summer. NBC News reporter Ed Augustin is in Havana with more.
They are the chants demanding change and the crowds of solidarity. A caravan of cars taking the streets of Miami in support of the activists who called on the Cuban people to rally against their government. But on the island, authorities have so far managed to contain demonstrations, avoiding the huge protests witnessed this summer when fury over dire economic conditions gripped the island, while COVID infection rates were sky high. It was a summer of anger, fury over dire economic conditions that gripped the island during the COVID pandemic. That frustration continues to simmer.
Dawn is just breaking, but already outside this supermarket, more than 100 people are standing in line. Many have been here since the day before.
Things have been like this ever since COVID. The pandemic made people's economic situation fall through the ground.
This young playwright has become the face of a new movement, trying to build on last summer's protests, demanding political and civic rights.
Cuba is not hell, but Cuba is not heaven. Cuba is very complicated. I think that we don't have democracy in Cuba, but the future for Cuba is our responsibility, without interference from anywhere in the world.
State-run television ran videos of Garcia meeting with American diplomats and attending a foreign-run workshop on how to involve the Cuban military in political change.
Al contrario, es mi derecho humano y constitucional caminar como un ciudadano libre por una de las calles llevando solamente una rosa blanca.
Garcia had planned a one-man march on Sunday, but authorities prevented him from leaving his house. Instead, the Cuban government organized its own rally in Havana's Central Park. Sitting on the ground, Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel. COVID rates were through the roof, and lockdown was grueling. Today, 76% of the population has been fully vaccinated, and cases are more than 10 times lower, according to the Cuban Ministry of Public Health. People are returning to work, schools reopened, and tourists will be welcomed back for the first time in more than 18 months. There are people who think like law student Elizabeth Rodriguez. She wants more economic opportunities, but also fears U.S. interference in Cuba's domestic affairs.
We need change, but we have to change it from inside the country, not being paid about an external government. You lose all credibility.
Then you meet others, like Adele Perez, one of the thousands who poured into the streets last summer. Even though this theatre actor was arrested, Perez plans to risk it all again.
If the police don't arrest me, yes, I am going to express my thinking about all this. I'm going to express my solidarity with the Cuban people.
All right, our thanks to Ed Augustin for that report.
And that does it for this hour of Morning News Now.
But the news continues right now. Stick with us.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.